Our top story this evening, former President Donald Trump has been found guilty on all 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. We know sentencing has been set for July 11th. We're going to have more on the verdict and what's next throughout the evening here on King 5. Today's verdict is historic, with former President Trump now being the first president in U.S. history to be convicted of a criminal offense.
Joining us right now to offer some context on today's verdict is Deborah Ahrens, criminal law professor from Seattle University. Deborah, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So first, can you walk us through the legal steps going forward? Not only what happens next, but what are the possible sentencing outcomes?
So the next thing that will happen in this case, most likely, is there will be a sentencing that's currently scheduled for July 11th. And at that point, the judge will consider a number of different factors and decide what to sentence former President Trump to. Each of those counts that he was convicted of carries a potential 4-year prison sentence. So his exposure here is fairly considerable. He doesn't have a criminal history. Or at least he doesn't have a criminal history of conviction. And these are crimes that don't involve violence or other things like that. So I think the common wisdom from attorneys I've spoken to in New York is he probably won't receive a prison sentence. He'll probably be sentenced to probation and or a fine. But some of the kinds of things that judges take into consideration at sentencing are things like, did the person who was just convicted show remorse for the crimes that they've been convicted of? How did they behave during the trial? And those are some factors that might cut against former President Trump during sentencing, because he was held in contempt a number of times and because I am skeptical that he is going to come to sentencing and express any sort of remorse.
Okay.
After sentencing, he'll have about 30 days to file a notice of appeal, and then appeals courts in New York may hear his case.
So let me ask you about that, because Trump said that he does plan to appeal. What are his chances here once that does happen?
Oh, when you go to trial, you're presumed innocent. I think that's something that language-wise we're all familiar with. In other words, we assume that everything the state is alleging isn't true and the state has to prove it. That shifts when you appeal. You're no longer presumed to be innocent. Now we assume that probably the jury acted reasonably, that if there were factual disputes at trial, probably the jury resolved those against you. And so instead of asking whether or not we think you're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a pretty high standard for jurors to have to meet, we now ask, could any reasonable juror, could any rational trier of fact have found you guilty? And that's a more difficult standard for a defendant to meet. That said, there will be potential legal issues on appeal that a judge on appeal will look at, what we call de novo. In other words, they'll independently decide whether or not perhaps the trial judge made an error in how they charged the jury. That's probably the most common source of successful appeals. But a lot of the things that former President Trump might not have felt went his way at trial, like the judge's rulings on evidentiary motions. On appeal, all those appellate judges are doing is reviewing things for abuse of discretion, and that's a hard standard for the defendant to meet.
Deborah, we know that the former president also faces other criminal cases. How will today's verdict affect those?
Well, one of the main things that being convicted of a crime does is it makes it more difficult for you to testify in other cases. I don't know if former President Trump had planned to testify at some of these other trials if they proceed, but if you do testify at trial and you've been convicted of a felony, particularly if you've been convicted of a felony involving deception, what we call a crimen falsi, then the state can use those prior convictions to say to a jury, hey, you shouldn't believe what this defendant is saying, what this witness is saying on the stand, because they've been convicted of a crime. So one very concrete thing that these convictions will do is make it much more difficult for former President Trump to testify on his own behalf at other criminal trials.
Deborah, one of the things that we know here is the former president has tried to weaken the integrity of the trial immediately after the verdict was read, saying that this was a sham, how the whole thing was rigged. How do his words impact not just the legitimacy of the trial and the process of the judicial process, but also the perception of the judicial process in this case and his future cases?
And that's something I think probably people's perceptions are going to depend on what they perceived about former President Trump in the first place. I think that part of what's been very interesting for all of those of us who have practiced criminal law, particularly those of us who are former criminal defense attorneys, is to look at some of the criticisms that former President Trump and his attorneys made during the trial, things like wanting to be able to have the last word during closing arguments as the criminal defendant. And we say, you know what? That's not the worst argument I've ever heard, but this is how certainly criminal trials have always been conducted. President Trump wasn't treated any differently than other criminal defendants. And so that's been sort of interesting to watch. But in terms of whether or not his personal critiques of the criminal justice system are going to be resonant with people, I genuinely think that's just going to depend on whether or not people like former President Trump in the first place.
And Deborah, we'll give you the last word here on anything else you might want to share with our viewers, but also any thoughts on how this, might move forward. We are in the middle of a presidential campaign, and obviously a lot of people just wondering how this might impact what's going to happen in November.
And that's obviously so hard to tell. There would be, as I mentioned, a sentencing in July, so that would precede any election, but probably an appeal isn't going to be heard until after the election. And I don't know what's going to happen on the timeline for the other cases that are proceeding against him. It is really difficult to know how this is going to affect the election, how it's going to affect voters. Certainly having felony convictions, for better or for worse, doesn't disqualify you from running for president. I do think there will probably be some voters for whom actually pulling the lever, or in this state, filling in a bubble for someone who's been convicted of multiple felonies, if you were already kind of on the line, might be difficult for you to go ahead and follow through with. But it's really difficult to know at this point whether what's going to happen is that people will react to these verdicts by saying, I'm not sure I want a person convicted of multiple felonies recently to become president, or if they'll react, as some may, by saying, well, the whole criminal justice system was rigged, and I'm more determined to vote for him than ever.
Well, we certainly want to thank you for your time. We are all watching this together, a very historic day for our entire nation. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.